Have you ever wondered how to get that perfect professional look on your quilts? Whether you're a seasoned quilter or you're just starting out, accurate cutting is a really important step to making sure that your quilts are going to look like you want them to. But even in tutorial videos from respected companies and voices in the industry, I find that people are doing one big thing wrong. This error can really propagate through your quilts, and the more that you cut, the bigger of a difference it's going to make. Let me show you how you can cut your quilts more quickly, accurately, and reduce waste by using the anchor method of quilt cutting. Accurate cutting relies on a few basics. You need a self-healing cutting mat on a firm surface, a rotary cutter with a sharp blade, a ruler, and of course your fabric. I'll provide links to my favorites in the description. For this demonstration, I'm cutting fabric for the binding of my Twinkle Lights quilt by Abby Made Patterns. I like to cut my binding strips 2.5 inches wide, and I need 7 strips along the width of my fabric to bind my quilt. The first thing that I need to do is square the edge of my fabric. I want this to be as close to perfect as possible because I'm going to be revisiting this cut again and again. I lay out my fabric folded in half and ensure that the selvages are exactly lined up. That's definitely the first piece of getting an accurate anchor cut. You should have a crease in the fabric at the halfway point, and if you look very closely, you should see that the lines of the individual strings that make up the fabric should be very, very straight. The direction that we're cutting in is the weft of the fabric, which is perpendicular to the warp. If your selvages aren't lined up and you see the warp of the fabric crossing over your crease, stop here and go press a really nice line. You may want to use a bit of water to get the perfect crease. I do that a lot when I'm making really precise adjustments. Now that you've got your fabric back on your cutting mat folded in half, depending upon the length of your ruler, you can either cut in one long cut or you can fold your fabric in half again, especially if you don't have a very, very long ruler. If you choose to fold your fabric in half again, we'll be using that selvage line once more as our point of reference. For the best accuracy, you're going to want to press this fold in as well. This is particularly important for long strips. Shorter strips you can kind of get away with a little bit of inaccuracy, but if you're looking for a really long strip, you definitely want to make sure that this is perfect. So now it's time to square up our fabric, and I'm going to cut my anchor cut. I'm not sure if there's another name for this, but I use the term anchor cut because it's a cut that we continue to move back to over and over and over again. This is the point of stability in our frame of reference. I lay my ruler up exactly at the selvage edge, making sure I'm exactly even. I also like to line mine up across the fold. Now, holding my ruler with pressure on my left hand, I open my rotary blade and cut the edges off of my fabric. If I'm making a particularly long cut, I'll stop halfway through, move my left hand up, and resume holding the ruler down with pressure before I finish my cut. While you can use the lines on your cutting mat, I strongly encourage you to use the lines on your ruler instead. The lines on your cutting mat can get bent and nicked over time, and your ruler is highly unlikely to have those same imperfections. So I need to rotate the fabric so that the edge is on the left because I'm right-handed. I'm always cutting away from myself, this is a big safety tip, with my dominant hand. So now here's where I see people make mistakes over and over and over again. When most people cut fabric, if you're cutting 2.5 inch strips, they cut each 2.5 inch strip individually and they base their next cut off of their last cut. When I measure, instead of measuring each cut individually, I cut as far away from my anchor line as I can and then move backwards. The reason for this is every time that you make a cut, you're adding a little bit of uncertainty into your measurements. As soon as you start cutting from a place that has possible errors, those errors can compound and get worse. I have an engineering degree, and this was really hammered home in my math and engineering classes. The technical term for it is the propagation of uncertainty. The idea behind the propagation of uncertainty is like you have a puzzle that has a piece that doesn't quite fit. Imagine that you're trying to measure how much something weighs, but the measuring tools that you're using aren't perfect. This can introduce a little bit of uncertainty or doubt into your measurements. Imagine that you're doing a series of calculations with these imperfect measurements. The propagation of uncertainty figures out how all of these different variables add up together and what the total uncertainty in your measurement might be. It's trying to estimate how accurate your overall result is when you're dealing with imperfect measurements. Even though we're not talking about something as complicated as a physics class here, the principle still is useful in something like quilting. For instance, think about cutting fabric. The measurements that you take might not be perfect, and there might be something different in the specific part of the fabric that you're using in your cut. Understanding how these imperfections and uncertainties can spread across your work can make you a much more thoughtful and accurate quilter, because you can plan for these uncertainties instead. I'm going to show you the two different methods of quilting and how the differences in accuracy will propagate. I start by squaring up my fabric, and then I start cutting 2.5 inch strips, referencing the last line that I cut each time I make a new cut. I know that with a long cut like this, I'm not going to be absolutely perfect each time. And on top of that, the narrower the strip that I'm cutting, the more likely I am to introduce some error. Now that I've cut my strips, let's take a look at the last one. Wow, it is way off. I was just a little bit off in the same direction every time, which means that I no longer have a perfectly square rectangle. It actually makes a really unseemly V where the fold was. Even a 1/16 of an inch added up a lot over my cuts. This is almost 3/4 of an inch of inaccuracy. Now I'm going to cut using the anchor method. Instead of measuring from a different cut each time, I'm measuring from my anchor cut for as many cuts as I can. I need 7 2.5 inch strips. The total width of all of the cuts that I need to make is 17.5 inches, which is 7 times 2.5. I don't have a ruler that's 17.5 inches long that can go across the entire cut, so what I'm going to have to do is divide it into one cut from my first anchor cut and then one set of cuts from my second anchor cut. Using this method, I make my first cut at 15 inches, which will be my anchor cut for any future strips. Next, I make a cut at 12.5 inches, then 10 inches, 7.5 inches, 5 inches, and 2.5 inches. I need one last strip, which I'm cutting 2.5 inches away from my second anchor cut. Each of these strips is still 2.5 inches, but I'm introducing a lot less error because I'm always using the same frame of reference for these cuts. I hope this helps you get accurate long cuts for your quilts, for things like bindings, sashings, and quilt elements. Do you have any cutting tips that I missed? Let me know in the comments below, and let me know if this is the type of content that you'd like to see. Thanks.